Erev Tov, everybody. Welcome to another edition of a Thursday night Parashat Shavua class. If you are listening online live, or if you are listening on the podcast, you're missing out some really good food here. And we invite you to join us next week with a surprise menu. We're not going to tell you what it is. You're going to have to come here and find out for yourselves. But listen. We're happy we're here. We're happy we're back.
It will never be salad. It will never be salad.
It's never going to be salad. All right? So there we go. So we're welcome everybody joining us online, listening on our podcast, Finding Holiness, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, wherever you hear your podcast. And we make a big announcement right now, actually, for those people listening. And we'll send a public notice tomorrow, but I'm happy to announce that we have our own website. Yeah, findingholiness.com.
Cool.
There you go.
Well done.
And
You got a name?
we got the name. Findingholiness.com. The idea there is that you can. I've archived the shiurim so that you can search by topic and by parasha and by idea, subject, whatever it is. So I've created a website. You can still go to the podcast website. That's the ones that I link, findingholiness.buzzsprout.com. But you can also access all the shiurim online, and I hope to update the website regularly with the new classes. But even at the bottom of the main page, you will see all the recent classes that I gave. So if you're just looking for the recent classes, it's there. But again, Baruch Hashem. Moving forward, yeah, it's good to have a website. So Baruch Hashem, welcome again to everyone who's joining us, walking in now. Please help yourself. Tonight's shiur is sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. Ami Ben Arosh in memory of his father, Mr. Mesod Ben Arosh, Zichron Livracha, as well as her mother, Mrs. Rachel Benaim, Zichron Livracha, and her sister, Mrs. Esther Berdugo, Zichron Livracha, Tina Sham Torah V'Chaim. May the words, Esther Berdugo, yes, sorry. Esther Berdugo, Zichronai Bracha. May the words that we say tonight be Lulu Nishmatam. Amen. We are going to focus on the opening pasuk of this week's Parashat Noach. Ele Toledot Noach. These are the offspring of Noach. Noach, Ish Tzadik Hayat Tamim Medorotav. Noach was a righteous man. He was perfect in his generations. And he walked with Hashem. Et Elokim hitalech Noach. You look at the word Tamim haya bedorotav, in his generations, plural. Rashi here very famously comments that there are those that interpret this word as being complementary to Noach, and there are those who interpret them being derogatory. Would he have been even greater tzaddikim, a greater tzaddik had he lived in the generation of other tzaddikim? Or perhaps had he lived in the generation of Abraham Avinu, then he would have not been considered so meritorious, or maybe even at all special. So bedorotav, that's the lashon of generations in plural. The comparison between Noach and Abraham stems from the fact that Noach was not simply described as a tzaddik, but he was specifically described as tzaddik bedorotav in his generations. So therefore this extra word bedorotav, which seems superfluous, is surely coming to teach us something, and we need to know what it's teaching us. And also we want to figure out why exactly is Noach being compared to specifically Abraham Avinu and not any of the other tzaddikim that came after him. We also want to find out, there's a Gemara that talks about the juxtaposition of the last pasuk in Parashat Bereshit and the opening pasuk in this week's parasha. The last pasuk Bereshit ended V'Noach matzahen be'enei Hashem. And Noach found favor in the eyes of God. And then this week's parasha begins Ele Toledot Noach. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. The Gemara tells us, Tanan deberi b'Yishmael, Af al Noach nechtach gezar din. The decree to punish and to destroy the world with the flood was also included Noach. Ela shematza chen be'enei Hashem. Only difference is that Noach found favor. He found favor in the eyes of Hashem, and he was spared as a result. So that was the idea. The last week's parasha ended with this statement from God saying, I regret even creating mankind, but v'noach matza chen b'nei Hashem. So me having reconsidered, me being HaKadosh Baruch Hu talking, having reconsidered making mankind, but Noach found favor in the eyes of God. If that's the case, if the Torah depicts Noach as a tzaddik, why was he included in the decree? It seemed that he was included in the decree, but he spared it. But if he's a tzaddik, why include it? More than that, if he was indeed flawed and he deserved to die in the Mabul, then how did he find favor in the eyes of Hashem? It's an oxymoron. What is it? Is he a tzaddik? If he's a tzaddik, then why was he included? And if he's not a tzaddik, then why did God find favor in his eyes? These are the questions that we're going to ask today. After all, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Hashem, Asher lo yisa panim velo yikach shochad. God who does not show favor, does not take a bribe. So how could it be? Is it tzaddik or not tzaddik? So the prevalent opinion amongst our commentators that Noah had a blatant character flaw in his character. And the Ashich talks about it, the Khatam Sofer, many others, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly could have spared Noach in many other ways. It would have been much simpler rather than having him build an ark for hundreds of years. He could have simply sent Noach on someplace, and Hashem would have just flooded or wiped out that whole area. It was said in the Midrash that Eretz Yisrael was not flooded. It was left dry. So he could have sent Noach to Eretz Yisrael. That would have been the end of it. What do you have to have him create an ark for? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved Noach from the treacherous waters of the Mabul. He incarcerated him in an ark with all these animals and beasts for an entire year. The Midrash tells us, Yud bet chodesh bateva lo ra'a shena velo bayom velo balayla. For 12 months, Noach didn't experience any sleep, no day and night, because he had to take care of the animals. He had to feed the animals all the time. So Noach, says the Chachamim, Noach was punished midah keneged midah. He was punished for secluding himself in his house and not rebuking the people who needed to be rebuked and needed to do teshuvah. So his punishment was to be in an ark with the animals where he couldn't sleep, and he had to be and feed them and keep them okay and comfortable. This was his punishment. There's another vital point that the Chachamim add, according to the Zohar, that even though Noach was a tzaddik, he possessed another character flaw, which was he neglected to pray. He didn't pray for the people of his generation not to be exterminated. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after the Chet HaEgel, what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? Moshe Rabbeinu prayed after the Chet HaEgel to spare the people. Moshe Rabbeinu said, listen, either you're going to spare the nation or wipe me out of I'm not interested. So Noach lacked that quality. It's for that reason that the Mabul is associated with Noach, as we're going to read in the Haftarah this week, where Yeshaya describes the Mabul as Mei Noach, the waters of Noach. So Noach could have averted the Mabul with his tefillot, but due to his failure praying for the generation, the death decree of the Mabul was associated with him and as well issued against him as well. So therefore, if you look at the end of last week's parasha, Parashat Bereshit, and the beginning of this week's parasha, we can explain the connection. Parashat Bereshit explains where God says, I'm going to obliterate mankind and I regret having created them. The Gemara learns from here that Noach was also included in the decree, but he was spared due to this divine favor, this hen, this special grace that was found in the eyes of God. So the reason why Noach was included in the decree is explained at the beginning of our parasha. Ele toledot Noach, Noach tzaddik haya b'dorotav. because of his righteousness, Noach was a tzaddik. He had the ability to transform the midat hadin, the strict judgment, God's way of bringing punishment, into midat rahamim. He had that ability. He could have prayed for them. We spoke about it in last week's shi'ur, how the tefillah has the power. It acts like an alter, is able to, like a pitchfork. It transforms midat adin into midat rachamim. So Noach had that ability, but he neglected to do so. In fact, the Torah tells us, Et ha'elokim hitalech Noach. Noach was following the Elokim, the strict judgment. He was complicit with midat hadin, which is associated with Elokim, to punish the people of generation. And therefore the decree also applied to him, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very strict when he deals with his tzaddikim. So now we need to explain, why was he spared? Given all these failures and flaws that he had, why was he spared from the flood? The Midrash tells us that V'Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem ele toledot Noach, says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, that we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestows favor upon the later generations in the merit of the earlier generations. And the Midrash asks, Rabbi Shimon says, where do we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu finds favor or bestows favor upon the earlier generation, the merit of the later generations? From the words, V'Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem, because it said Noach found favor in the eyes of Hashem, and it was in the merit of his offspring, of Noach's offspring, that God found favor. Sheneimar ele toledot Noach. Very confusing midrash. Comes the Chida in his Sefer Chomat Anach, and he brings down in the name of the Rabbeinu Ephraim that this midrash that said that in the merit of the offspring he was saved. Who's the offspring? Avraham Avinu. He's the offspring here, who descended from Noach's son, Shem. The Pasuk tells us, Vayizkor Elokim et Noach, that Hashem remembered Noach and all the animals that were in the ark. Vayavor Elohim ruach ala aretz, vayashoku amayim. God caused a spirit to pass over the earth, vayashoku amayim, and the water subsided. Says the Midrash, that says the Chida, Vayaver Elohim Ruach Sofet Tevot Ramach Reish Mem Het 248, which is Gematria Avraham. So that, what did God cause? What happened that allowed the waters to subside? It was HaKadosh Baruch Hu recalling the merit of Avraham, who was destined to come from Noach, from Shem, the son of Noach, and that caused the water to decide. Through Avraham Avinu, a future offspring caused Noach savior, and the water subsided. In fact, the Khatam Sofer says that Avraham Avinu was 58 years old when Noach passed away. By the way, the gematria of Noach is 58. We're gonna work on this number a little bit as we go through. Avraham Avinu was 48 years old at the time of the Dora Pelaga, the generation of the tower, the dispersion, and Noach lived 10 more years after that incident. So therefore, Avraham was 58 years old when Noach passed away. In fact, it's also pointed out in the commentary of the Ibn Ezra, who writes, Ele toledot Noach, Noach tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. He also asks, why does it say bedorotav in his generations? It should have just said bedoro, in his generation. And he says, because the pasuk is referring to the generations that followed Noach. That's his perush. In addition to the generation of the flood, which was Noah's generation, but also the generation of Abraham, because he went into the years of Abraham 58 years. And therefore, this is alluded to in the pasuk, that Abraham was Nun Het, was 58 years old when Noach died. So now reread the pasuk. According to the Ibn Ezra, Ele toledot Noach, these are the generations of Noach. Noach, 58, a man who was a true tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav, is referring to Avraham Avinu, who lived for 58 years while Noach was alive. And that also works well with how the Torah describes Avraham as Hitalech lefanai ve'yeh tamim. Avraham Avinu was also a person who was called tamim, who was called tzaddik, pure, righteous, and complete. So upon seeing that the holy Avraham Avinu was going to descend from Noach, so therefore, Et Elokim hitalech Noach walked with God. He passed on to the next world in peace. So let's connect these two ideas so far. We have a Gemara that taught us that the decree to wipe out mankind with the Mabul also included Noach. In the Midrash, it teaches us that Noach found favor in the eyes of Hashem in the merit of his offspring that was going to come afterwards, which was Abraham Avinu. On one hand, he was guilty of not chastising his people and getting them back on the right path and not praying for them. On the other hand, he received a divine favor on account of Abraham Avinu who descended from him. It seems to be that Avraham Avinu made amends for Noach's shortcomings. Noach failed to rebuke his generation, and Avraham strove to guide his people in the ways of Hashem. We see that in a couple of places that Vayita Eshel Vivershava Vayikra B'Shem Hashem El Olam, that he planted an Eshel in Beersheba, this tree in Beersheba, this is Avraham Avinu, and there in Beersheba he proclaimed the name of Hashem, God of the universe. So see, Abraham's mission was teaching about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then when it came to Sodom, also, Vayan Avraham Vayomer Hinena ho'alti ledaber el Adonai ve'anochi afar va'efer. Behold, now I began to speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm humble, but I want to pray on behalf of the people of Sodom to save them. So we see that this was Abraham. So Abraham almost came to rectify that of Noach. During those last 58 years, it is brought down in the holy books, during which Noach was privileged to still live amongst Abraham Avinu, or Abraham Avinu was alive during the last years of Noach. It seems to be that Noach instructed Abraham Avinu not to make the same mistakes that he did. Instead, he needs to chastise his generation, guide them on the way of Hashem, pray on their behalf. In other words, during those 58 years, Abraham Avinu was instructed by Noach to be metaken, to rectify the deficiencies that he had inside him and through his life. And in that merit, Brera, retroactively, Noach found favor in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and was spared from the Mabul. And this explains actually very nicely the Midrash that we said with the juxtaposition of the two Pesukim. In reality, Noach should have died in the Mabul because he neglected to rebuke and pray for the people of his generation. But he found he found grace in the eyes of God. He found in the merit of of the Nun Chet, of the 58, which is the same letters as Chen, which we're going to get to, the same letters of Chen in reverse, 58, in the merit of Abraham Avinu, that he enjoyed those 58 years of his life. Then the Khatam Sofer says, Ele toledot Noach, these are the offspring of Noach, Tzaddik Tamim Haya Bedorotav, namely Abraham Avinu, whose life overlapped his with 58 years. During those last 58 years, he taught Abraham how to make amends for his shortcomings, and in that merit he found favor in the eyes of God and was saved from the Mabul. That's why the Torah emphasized that he was a Tzaddik Bedorotav in his generations. The Torah is drawing a comparison between Abraham and Noach. That was one of the questions we started with. Noach was spared solely for the in merit of the offspring of Abraham. So what does Rashi say? Again, there are those who explain this, who view him in a positive light. All the more so, had Noach lived in a generation of tzaddikim, he would have been even more righteous. That's how Rashi starts. They were alluding to the fact that Noach lived at a time of Abraham, and he made it a point to rectify the mistakes that he did. So lo kol sheken, if he was around people that were with multitudes of chachamim and tzaddikim, he would have lived a great life. He instructed Abraham to rebuke, so Noach would have been an even greater tzaddik. Then Rashi says there are those who say that Noach would have been, we view him disparagingly, that, he wouldn't have been such a great tzaddik if he lived in the time of Abraham. He wouldn't have been considered anything special. What was the point of teaching me that? Here the Chachamim are teaching us why he was spared. solely in the merit of Abraham. In comparison to Abraham, he was nothing. Why? Because he failed to rebuke his contemporaries. He failed to rebuke the people that lived with him like Abraham did. But still, Noach's shevach, his praiseworthiness, came as a result of his failures. Why? Because he was able to see and teach Abraham Avinu to fix his own ways. So therefore, this view sees both Noach in a positive light in a way. Noach found favor in God's eyes in the merit of his descendant Abraham, who made amends for his failures. Okay, that's all great. Baruch Hashem, I'm happy. But let's take a step more into it and get really into the beauty of it. Clearly, this all was orchestrated from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Noach would have had the privilege to spend time with Abraham Avinu for 58 years of his life. V'Noach matza chen b'nei Hashem. Ish tzadik tamim haya, tamim bidrachav, tzadik b'ma'asav. He was perfect in his ways, he was righteous in his deeds. He was a holy person, Noach. Rashi says, what does it mean, tamim bidrachav? What does it mean, tamim, perfect in his ways? Humble and lowly spirit. This is what he says. Noach was a humble person with a lowly spirit. And what does it mean, tzadik b'ma'asav? Meaning he was devoid of corruption, robbery. He didn't have that midah of robbery like everybody else was. Meaning, the pasuk is attesting to the fact that he was humble, and he was yashar. He was a honest man. I want to quote for everybody here a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. The Gemara says, "Amri lei Rabbanan Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi." The rabbi said to Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, "Atu dardike ha'idna lebe midrasha." Young students came to the Bet Midrash today. Ve'amru mile, and they said something. De'afilu bimei Yoshua bin Nun lo yitmar kevatayu. That even from the days of Yoshua bin Nun, this stuff hasn't been said. They were saying Divrei Torah on the Aleph Bet. And the Gemara goes on to continue. They started expounding all the letters. But when they got to the letter Nun, they said the following, these young students. The bent Nun and the straight Nun, these were the words. Nun kefufa, that's the regular Nun. And Nun peshuta is the long Nun that comes at the end of the word. Nun sofit. Ne'eman kafuf, ne'eman pashut. It alludes to a faithful person who is bent over, and it alludes to a faithful person who is erect. Okay, this is the Gemara. According to Rashi, on this Gemara, teaches us that a faithful, kosher person has to be, one, bent over and humble in this world, and as a result, he will stand straight and proud in Olam Haba. And therefore, when the Torah is implying about Noach, the Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem, this is exactly what they're talking about. This is how they're describing Noach. The first letter in the word in Noach, the first letter in Noach is a Nun kafuf, is a bent Nun, which implies that Noach demonstrated humility in the way he behaved. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu rewarded that behavior by transforming and rearranging the letters from Noach to Chen, which has now a straight Nun at the end, an elongated Nun. In other words, by saving Noach from the Mabul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu enabled him to stand tall and erect for the rest of his life, so he could be a positive source of inspiration, and then again pass on to the next world in Olam Haba straight. V'Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem, says the Chatam Sofer, something unbelievable. He says that these students, they came to Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and they said, and what did he say? We heard something that has not been said since the times of Yoshua ben Nun. How did they know this? So you have the bent Nun, and the straight Nun, refer to a faithful person who is bent over, and a faithful person who is erect. You see, humility, which again we spoke at length in last week's class, humility is an outstanding quality. It's very admirable. We have to strive. It's arguably, if not according to most books of Musar, it is the most important midah that a person has to have. But that only applies when it comes to his own personal honor. When a person's own self-esteem, a person has to be humble. When it comes to kevod shamayim, when it comes to the honor of heaven, you have to adopt the attitude of pride and arrogance related to kedusha. Like the Gemara says, a person has to say that this world was created bishvili, for me. Does it sound arrogant? It's not arrogant. Because the mitzvot that I do, the honor that I give to Hashem, I'm proud of that. And I act that way. Vayikba libo bedarchei Hashem, says Divrei Yamim. His heart was uplifted, vayikba gova lev, in the ways of God. Because without a level of arrogance or pride when it comes to the honor of Hashem, or matters of Kedusha, you will fall prey to the Yetzer Hara. You won't survive. Because the Yetzer Hara is going to trick you into acting with misguided humility. And therefore, the Yetzer Hara, what it does, it encourages a person to believe that he's a sinner and he's not worth it, and there's no point in doing this mitzvah, there's no point in coming to synagogue, there's no point in giving tzedakah because you're a sinner anyways, and therefore you won't want to perform any acts of kedusha, such as studying Torah, performing mitzvot. So a person has to be proud to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and with all of his might. So it says the Khatam Sofer that the bent nun alludes to this trait of humility, to a person who is sitting bent over with a lowly spirit. On the other hand, you have an elongated nun, a straight nun, alludes to the person who serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu with pride. And a person has to serve Hashem in both of these ways, like the bent nun and straight nun. Says the Khatam Sofer, unbelievable. The Gemara, that same Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kufhei Amud Bet, says that the Zekenim, the elders who lived at the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, died young. Why did they die young? Because they didn't eulogize him properly when he died. When Yehoshua died, they didn't give him the proper eulogies that were required, so they died young as a punishment. The pasuk tells us in Sefer Devarim, Vayikra Moshe liYoshua, when Moshe was about to die, he calls Yehoshua and he says, Vayomer elav le'nei kol Yisrael. He told him in front of everybody, Chazak ve'ematz, be strong, courageous, ki ata tavo et ha'am hazeh la'aretz shenishbah Hashem la'avotam. This was him basically in front of everybody that you're going to be the next leader. Rashi says the elders have to be with you. Everything are going to be done in accordance with their opinion and their advice. You're going to bring them into the land, and it's good, but you're going to be the one in charge. And everything depends on you. And you got to make sure, and Rashi even uses the lashon of take them and hit them with the crown on their head to make sure that they understand that you're the one in charge. There's only one leader in a generation, not two. And the Torah tells us explicitly that this was what Moshe's directive was, to lead to Yehoshua, to lead Bnei Israel with strength, with vigor. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu we know was humble. Va'ish Moshe anav meod. Moshe was the bent nun. That's who he was. He was the bent nun. Yehoshua, who led with strength, remember Yehoshua was the warrior. He went out there and fought. He was comparable to the straight nun. The Zekenim, the elders, says the Khatam Sofer, were unaware that he was commanded to lead with this type of nun. They were expecting Yehoshua to act like Moshe, the humble like the bent nun. So when Yehoshua didn't act that way, and he lived his life in a different manner than Moshe did, and then he died, they didn't eulogize him properly. They gave him a basic eulogy. And because of that, they were punished and they died young. He led Israel mightily because he was commanded to do so. Chazak ve'emas. This is the way you have to do it. So therefore, when the Gemara says that the young children expounded something that was not heard, that was not expounded since the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, it was referring specifically to the letter Nun. They went through every single letter of the Aleph Bet. But they got to the letter Nun, and they spoke about the bent Nun and the straight Nun, how they both represent an Ish Ne'eman, a trustworthy, faithful individual, one bent over and one elongated. On one hand, it's essential to behave in a way with humility, and on the other hand, you have to demonstrate pride and strength in keeping with the pasuk, like we said, Vayikba b'Hashem, that they served HaKadosh Baruch Hu with pride. And their mistake was that they didn't expound it that way. Had they expounded in the times of Yehoshua, this is what the children were referring to. Had they expounded in the time of Yehoshua, they would have recognized Yehoshua's true character, that he was a humble individual, but it was a different type of noon. It was a noon that was elongated. They would have eulogized him properly. And that's what's named. The Khatam Sofer actually writes these are his words. Ve'hainu Yehoshua binun shehevin inyan hanun kipshitato. Yehoshua understood the significance of the letter Nun, like the way it was supposed to, although he doesn't elaborate on this. But what he's saying is that Yehoshua understood that there's two Nuns. There's a bent Nun and there's a straight Nun. And he was commanded to lead the Jewish people with vigor and strength, like the elongated Nun. In fact, he was called Yehoshua bin Nun. His father's name was Nun. And Nun, his father's name, begins with a bent Nun, and it ends with a straight Nun. The former alludes to the trait of humility, and the latter alludes to the pride and the arrogance that a person has to come with regards to Kedusha. And what's in the middle? The Vav. And whenever we have a Vav, the Vav is what connects the two aspects of the letter Nun. And therefore that's hinted in his name, Yehoshua bin Nun. He understood the significance of that combination of humility and the pride of Kedusha. Let's go back to Noach. Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem. And we said the Gemara earlier that even though Noach had the decree of the Mabul against him and he was supposed to die, he found favor in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It seems that his failure to rebuke all the people living in his generation and pray on their behalf, why did he fail? Because he was too humble. Because of his humility. He considered himself unworthy to rebuke them. He didn't contain that pride to defend God, defend the honor of God. And that's why Noach was punished. To be saved from the Mabul, you had to be now forced, incarcerated in the ark. That was his punishment. With all the wild animals and feeding the lions and the monkeys and all the other wild beasts that were there. That was his punishment. But then he endured that punishment. Okay, he had to get punished. It was humiliating. He recognized the mistakes that he made. He realized that he should have spoken up. He should have prayed for his people. He realized the mistake that he acted with humility when it came for God, when it came for Kevod Hashem. And he should have been straight. He should have been He should have been proud. So he had to correct himself. So what did he do? What did God do? HaKadosh Baruch Hu arranged that Abraham Avinu be born in his lifetime for the last 58 years. And he arranged that Noach meet Abraham so that he could teach Abraham not to follow his example. And you have to admonish and pray for the people at the same time. And that's the significance of the Nun Chet, of the 58 years that their lives overlapped. Those years enabled Noach to transform and rearrange the Noach that begins with a bent Nun, which alludes to humility, and rearrange it to Hen, to the elongated Nun, with a straight Nun, which alludes to the pride and the arrogance. And that's the explanation of the Gemara statement. Even upon Noach who resembled the bent Nun, because of his humility, the punishment was decreed. The punishment was decreed because he acted with humility when it came to the honor of God. But he found favor in the eyes of God. But eventually, because he foresaw that Abraham Avinu would descend from him, he did teshuvah, and he would be able to transform the Noach into the Hen. And that's exactly what he did for those 58 years when Abraham Avinu was alive. And we'll end with this last point. Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem. Remember, Noach was supposed to die, but he found favor in the eyes of Hashem. The Gemara tells us, Kol makom she'ata motze gvurato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Wherever you find HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness, ata motze anvatnuto. You also find his humility. Chachamim tell us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man with two eyes. Why did he create man with two eyes? The scientists will tell you so that we have depth and perception, which is true, right? With one eye, you don't have any depth. You can't perceive how deep or how far away something is. But the tzaddikim tell us that we have two eyes. One eye, we're meant to recognize our own faults and our own lowliness and where we come from. And the second eye, we're meant to recognize the greatness of the Creator, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Brought down in many holy books, specifically the Noam Elimelech. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us with two eyes for that purpose, so too God looks upon us, Bnei Israel, with two distinct eyes. With one eye, HaKadosh Baruch Hu treats us with humility, and He waives His honor to forgive a sinner who regrets his transgressions and performs teshuvah. This was the subject of last week's discourse on Parashat Bereshit. He was ma'avir al midotav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu just forgets about it, and He's going to forgive a person. And with the second eye, that God looks down at us, He demonstrates His rulership. He demonstrates His sovereignty by punishing the wicked at the same time. Melech b'mishpat ya'amid aretz. Through justice, a king establishes a land. And therefore, that is what's alluded to in this pasuk. Ve'noach matzachen be'anei Hashem. And Noach found favor in the eyes of God. He was able to transform his name Noach into Chen, and ultimately exemplified both aspects of the Nun, the bent Nun and the straight Nun. And as a result, that's how he found favor in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It caused HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kibiyachol, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have physical eyes, but to look upon His people, upon Him, with two distinct eyes. His greatness and His humility. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Be well.
Okay, three things. Save them.